Welcome back to the Ruy Lopez Masterclass. Today we are going to talk about the bishop c5 sideline. This is known as the classical variation. This is going to be the first chapter in this entire course. So let's jump straight in. I will remind you very briefly that there is going to be a PGN file attached to this chapter and every single chapter that we're going to look at, and I'd urge you to take a look at those PGN files on your own time. I think they can be very helpful to review these lines and the ideas. So bishop c5. What's the idea from the black perspective? Well, of course, the bishop is simply very active on c5, right? It is hitting f2. It is on its optimal diagonal, the most active piece, and later they just want to very calmly finish development and claim that their pieces are very optimally placed. Now, this is a very strong argument, and if we play very passively, and let's say we just, play d3 and castle and develop the knight, then we're actually giving black everything they want. They have very good piece placement going into the middle game. So what we need to do is make a point out of the bishop on c5, which the downside, of course, of this piece is that it's very funny and targetable, right? It sits there asking to be hit, and we're going to play c3 immediately, trying to target it with d4 and not let black achieve their optimal setup. We're going to harass the bishop that otherwise, again, would be sitting on a very strong diagonal. So c3 is the move I'm recommending. I think this is objectively the best and also certainly the most principled, and we're trying to go for d4. Okay, so from this position, after we play c3, what are black's options? How are we going to kind of break down the opening tree? Well, there's kind of two different types of moves that black can play. They can play a little bit more dubious moves. So the move f5 is something we're going to look at, and it's a very interesting try, and it's not, immediately punishable, but it does allow some interesting complications that after watching this video, you'll understand why they tend to work out better for the white player. So f5 is one line we're going to look at. I'm also going to very briefly look at the move d6 here, and I think I'm just showing d6 because it's actually a blunder, this move, and we already win a piece going into the middle game, which is kind of insane to think about. But the reason I'm showing it is just to help you see how strong the strike of d4 can be, right? So if black ignores it by playing d6 and they also open up this diagonal, they're already losing. So d6 we're going to look at, f5, and then we're going to look at the main moves. And there's two of those. There's the move knight from g to e7. And the idea of this move is to develop the knight in a way where it hits the d5 square, so they want to push d5 later, but in a place where it's not as targetable as f6. And that's because the other main move is knight f6, but the downside of this move is that after we play d4, the knight ends up being hit very often by a pawn coming to e5. Okay, so I know that that kind of seems a lot, but don't worry, we're going to take this step by step, and we're going to start by looking at sort of the worst option that black has, which is this move d6. And like I said, this is already simply a blunder, but I think it's a useful one to point out because A, it's not obvious how you punish this move, but B, it does again show you the worth of our c3 and d4 plan and how powerful this plan can be if it can come to fruition with black not playing optimally. So d4 is of course the move that we're playing. And funnily enough, and a good way to remember the move d4 is that it doesn't matter what they play against all of these four options, we're playing d4. So that's sort of consistency that I think is helpful to remember these lines. But okay, d6, we play d4 now. Black's idea is that they notice that we're hitting the bishop, and if the bishop simply moves away, we have d5, right? They opened up this diagonal, and that could be very bad. We're already going to be winning a piece here, but their idea, what they were hoping for, is to give this check on b4. And what they're claiming is that after we play a move like bishop d2, they're going to trade the pieces off, and then they're going to be able to address the issue of the pin by playing bishop to d7, and therefore taking away the strength of the move d5. So this is their plan. So after we play d4, they're taking, and then they're going to put the bishop on b4. The issue, and what they maybe did not expect, is this move king f1, which is a mind-blowing move. It's really strong, and the idea is that we're still threatening d5, but now after they defend, the difference is that the bishop is on b4. We haven't traded away this bishop, and this bishop on b4 is a massive liability for black. They always have to watch out for this bishop, and after queen a4, unfortunately, a3 is a threat to win the bishop. There's also the idea of simply taking the knight and then removing the defender, and they have too many pieces that are sort of discoordinated, and there's simply no way to defend everything. So we're going to win a piece here, and again, the engine already thinks we're winning. If they, for example, bring the knight out, hoping that after we take, they can take with the knight and defend the bishop a little bit further, unfortunately, we can simply start with d5, and again, the second the knight moves, the bishop hangs, otherwise we take the knight and take the bishop and so on. So d6 already a blunder, but I should mention it because it's not exactly obvious, this king f1 idea. But now that you know it, hopefully you'll be able to punish d6 players. And by the way, I've had opponents online who have played d6. It's definitely a common blunder for black to run into. Let's look at f5, the second option for black. Now, the move f5 is obviously very confrontational. They are not only spending time bringing their bishop to its most active post, but they also just want to open up the f-file, later castle, and just crush us from the get-go. So we are not going to let this happen. We're going to respond fire with fire, and we're going to play d4. We're going to crash through the center. The most principled option, c3, prepared this move. There's no reason not to play it. Now, there is some complications here that we should go through. The main move is to take this pawn. I'll quickly show what happens if they take the other pawn, because it's not so good, but we have to know how to punish it. And there's this one move, e5. And this is a really important move to remember, and I don't think it's that natural, because it seems like we're just, giving a pawn and we're not taking it back, but instead we're making a move with our own pawn. But the point is that the e5 pawn is so strong that it's worth giving away a pawn to put a pawn on e5. It stops their knight from coming to f6. It gives us so much space on the king side, and I'll just show how this can develop. After they take greedily the other pawn on c3, we're simply developing our pieces, and the bishop's coming to g5, the knight's coming to d5. The position's already completely crushing for white. So knight to e7, we already can castle first, and after they castle, knight d5. Right, so it's always a good idea just to get the king safe, and we can afford to spend a tempo doing that, and then knight to d5, because them castling does not change the situation. We still have bishop g5, and on the contrary, the king could even be hit along this newly opened diagonal because they played f5. So always look for queen b3, bishop c4 ideas to hit the king on g8, and otherwise, they can't take the knight here on d5. It's immune because we're going to take and we're going to win a piece. And if they don't take, then bishop g5 is coming. So I'll just show one line after d6. An important move here, play b4. Do not immediately go bishop g5, because after they take the pawn, their bishop defends the knight, so we can't take here and remove a defender because they still have enough defenders. So what we have to do is start by playing b4, kick the bishop away, and then play bishop g5. And again, the point is after they take, the bishop is no longer defending the knight, so now we can take on c6, and there's nothing they can do. If they take with the knight, they lose their queen. If they take with the pawn, the knight here hangs on e7, sorry. So yeah, the position crumbles very quickly if they take the wrong pawn. Their best option is instead to take the pawn on e4. But here we're fine as well. We first take the knight. If they take our knight, we can remove our bishop from danger and recapture. This would be quite good. And instead, if they continue by taking simply the bishop, probably the better option. Here's the one idea to remember in these positions with f5 and then them taking on e4. The one thing to remember is that we want to spend a time giving this check on h5, making them play g6, and then bringing the queen back to its optimal square on e2, where it's hitting the e4 pawn. And the reason we spend time like this is clearly because it just weakens their setup even further, and it makes it very difficult for them to castle later on the king side. So there is one game example that I'll show. Very natural development. The bishop comes to f4, the knight comes to d2, and again, they can't really castle on the king side. They castled long here, but white castles short, and the pawn on g6 is also not a very aggressively placed pawn. If anything, they at some point might even want to move it to g5 because it's not doing anything to further their attack. And then in the meantime, white is going to be able to maneuver their pieces towards the queen side, towards the black king, and open in the center. And opening in the center is going to be very strong. You can see that white just has clear dominance on that part of the board, and they can even play g4 here. So, okay, the game continued, and white certainly ended up winning, but you can see it's largely due to the central control that they have. And I think that that is actually an important point to note, that in these lines, white is the one that has the big center, right? They have one pawn here on e4 that we can get rid of by playing f3, and after that, we have all of the fun in the center of the board. So that was f5. Somewhat tricky. You should know some of the lines, but if you play d4 and then you develop more or less naturally, then you should be doing quite well. Okay, now we get to the main lines. So the first one of them is this move knight g to e7. And like I said, the idea with this move is to prepare the break d5 very quickly. And in fact, you'll see after d4, they take, give the check, and then play d5. So this is their idea for sure. And the point is that the knight is not an f6, so it's less vulnerable to attacks by e5. And this is a very solid way to play. What I recommend is playing e5 anyways. Okay, so I'll take a step back just quickly to look at the first move. So after knight comes to e7, we play d4 like always. They take. If they give the check, we do not trade pieces. We do not want to give away our attacking chances, because after d5, e5, indeed we have quite strong attacking chances. So we do not want to trade pieces. And you can see with the pawn formation on d4 and e5, that lends itself very nicely to a kingside attack. So there is one game to show how this can develop. If the bishop comes to g4, the other thing that I'll point out quickly, black has played a lot on the queen side. You have a pawn advanced on the queen side, you have a bishop and knight, and another knight kind of aiming towards that side of the board, and we're clearly going to attack on the king side. So there's a lot of open space here that gives us the potential to attack on this side of the board. So the best option for black is to start bringing their pieces over to this side of the board in order to lend a bit more support to the king. So as white, what we're going to do is trade away those pieces that find themselves on the king side to again open up the position and give ourselves attacking chances. So I think this strategically was really nice. So bishop e2, and then you'll see we have a trade of the bishop, and then we have a trade of the knight. And the resulting position is one where it is clear that it is simply white who is attacking because of all of these open space and the lack of pieces that black has on the king side. So I hope that that sort of makes sense. This is obviously much deeper than the opening theory. This is already later into a middle game, but f4 comes, and the position really plays itself. I will mention there was one mistake in this game, which was this position here, where white played knight f4, giving away the pawn on d4. Perhaps they missed that they can take the pawn due to this check. So if you take the queen, knight e2 comes. And this was an unnecessary complication. It was better to simply defend the pawn and then play for this knight f4 idea. And white would be totally winning. But the attack still definitely sits strong here. And yeah, the attack plays itself, and white ends up winning. You cannot take the rook because the king would be too exposed with the bishop on h6, and mate would quickly follow, and the position developed further, and black resigned here. There's simply too many attacking ideas. The bishop's hit. If you defend the bishop with the rook, queen to h4 is mate. So yeah, a nice game over here for sure. And I think that this is sort of the main plan that I want to emphasize with these knight coming to e7 lines, where we're playing for d4, and after they go for their only active plan, which is to break in the center, we want to play e5 and go for the attack. And that means trading strategically pieces on the king side, castling our king, and then breaking later with this move f4. Okay, so now this takes us to the final and the main move. If you only had to study one line, focus on this part of the video. After bishop c5, c3, knight f6 is the main continuation, and it's probably the most objectively challenging and critical one because their knight sits on its most active post. The downside, though, very similar to the bishop sitting on c5, it's active, but it's also very vulnerable to this e5 push, and we're going to take advantage of this. So d4 is what we play. They kind of have to take, there's simply too much pressure, and after they take, e5 immediately, right? We do not spend time recapturing, but we harass the knight and force it to make a decision, and there's really only one of two squares that it can go to. There's the square on e4, and there's the square on d5, and this takes us to sort of different positions, but our next move immediately is castling regardless. So let's start by looking at knight d5. This is the second most popular option. Knight e4 is slightly more popular, but knight d5 is definitely playable and something that you should be familiar with. We castle, like I said, and they cannot take the pawn on c3 because their knight hangs, and otherwise we're going to take on d4 next. So After they castle, we take on d4, and if you just look at this position, it's one where in the center of the board, we have pawns and they have pieces. And so we win, right? This is a better configuration for us because our pawns are just more effective. They attack their pieces, which means we gain more space, and we also gain more time. Their pieces have to move. So generally, it's good to have these pawns in the center because they can stake out a very strong claim for us. So bishop to b6, and now a very nice move, bishop c4. We are hitting the knight, and it's actually rather difficult to defend this knight. They have to move one of their knights to e7 to defend sort of the other one. We'll start by looking at this one, which is slightly worse because it's taking their more active knight away and allows specifically the move d5. And again, you see this theme of our pawns just grabbing space, and so much space. So a3, and now simply bishop g5, and the entire position collapses. d6 is coming, and yeah, game over. There's a game continuation here. If you want to see the conversion, check out the PGN, but definitely white manages to win very convincingly. So that is what happens if this knight comes back here. You play d5, and bishop g5 is coming, and d6 is coming, and the attack, again, sort of plays itself. The other knight coming to e7 is better, but it's not going to solve their problems. So we play bishop g5, immediately hitting and challenging and pinning their knight that was just moved to the e7 square, and after they unpin, we play knight c3. And the point is, if they take this knight, then now we have established a monster of a center. Our pieces, our bishops are so strong. This position is, again, one that really plays itself. I mean, white is certainly in the driver's seat here. I'll show one continuation of a game. We crash through in the center on e6. We take all of the pawns. The knight, by the way, look at how sad it is, right? It was pinned once by the bishop, and then the queen moved, and now it's pinned again by the rook, and the position just collapses completely, and we transform into an endgame where white is simply in a risk-free position, and is in fact winning. I mean, too many pawns in the center are rolling down the board, and very convincingly in this pawn endgame, it's no surprise that white ended up converting. So let's go all the way back. This was in this position here if they take with the knight, and I'll just show they can't really ignore it. I mean, they can play c6, but then we bring the knight to e4. This is the other idea, and we're just taking advantage of the dark squares in their position. So the knight actually coming to f6 is a very thematic idea here, and they had to get rid of our pawn, otherwise the knight is pinned here, and the dark squares are too weak, so they gave back a piece, but this does not solve their problems, and on the contrary, the queen is infiltrating, and the game is ending. What a masterpiece, by the way. Look at this. And here, black resigned with mate coming. So, yeah, very fun games. And you can see this largely comes from white's extra center and their extra space and their extra pieces. And this is why the knight coming to d5 is not so strong. It's just very flimsy, and it's very vulnerable to these attacking ideas with bishop c4. Okay, so this was one of the lines. The knight coming to e4 is the more popular option. And we castle, like I said, we respond similarly with castling. And black has to make a decision here. Note that the pawn on c3 is not really something that black can take, because we come queen d5, and they have to solve a pretty serious question here. The bishop is hit, the knight is hit. If the knight moves, the bishop is actually able to be captured. So they kind of have to just kind of take on f2 here and try to win the rook for the two pieces. But we don't actually take the knight. We first take the pawn because the knight is trapped. Knight g4, h3, and it can't go anywhere. If it comes to h6, it saves itself, and black is up material. But unfortunately, the dark squares, much like the game that we just saw, are just going to kill black. So this is a non-starter for black. They're not going to walk into this. We're much better there. So after we castle, d5 is definitely the main move, and after we take, we get a similar position, but instead of the knight on d5, it's a pawn, and so this is a stronger way for black to play, and here I recommend h3, simply stopping the bishop from coming to g4, and after castles, I actually stop the theory here, and this seems a little bit weird, but let me explain something. So, okay, generally speaking, this is our plan. We're putting the bishop on e3, the knight on c3, the bishop can drop back to d3, the rooks can come in, the queen can come to the c file, And what you'll notice is that black has two bishops, so a lot of times after sort of the tension here on c6 gets resolved, they put a pawn on c5 to open up the position to help their bishops. And when that time comes, it's useful for a queen to be on c2 where it can kind of hit that c5 pawn. So that is one thing to note. This is probably the single most important position in the entire video. And the reason I say this is because it's the main line of the classical variation, right? We're talking about knight f6, which is the main move, and then we're talking about knight e4, which is the main move. And this is the natural continuation in those lines. So if this is the main line, how do I recommend that you study this? Well, again, I don't think it's very useful to just start looking at different branching points in theory because it just goes in so many different directions. Here's what I recommend. There are 6 games that Bb5 played from this exact position. In fact, it's funny because he got to this position via a different move order in the Italian. And so he's actually lost a tempo and it's black to move here, and yet he won 5 out of 6. Right, he scored 5 out of 6 in those games against the best players in the world, including, for example, Kramnik. So those are really instructive games from these structures, and what I would simply recommend is you get the PGN, obviously for free in the description, and then you just navigate either on Lichess or chess.com or whatever you'd like through those games, and it will teach you a lot about how to play and navigate these structures from both sides and primarily from the white side. So again, I talked very broadly about the sort of developing scheme that you want to be going for here, and I think it's quite natural. And I talked about the plan that black has of breaking with c5, but if you really want to see these ideas in action, and I highly recommend you do, then get the PGN, and then again, you are going to look through a different move order, so starting with bishop c4, but you'll see that we fully transpose, but it's actually black to play here, whereas in our line, it's white to play. So we get an improved version of this transposition, and Bb5 navigates these positions extremely well. If you look at those 6 games in those main positions, you'll have a very strong start to begin playing these positions with the white pieces. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new around here, like this video. If you have any questions about this masterclass or this video in particular, then leave them down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.